welcome back to Opal&Mint. I am Ashley and the day is finally here. I've been prepping for this video for quite a while now. It took a lot more work, a lot more time, a lot more testing than I anticipated, but I'm so glad that I took the time to do this. I am super excited for this video and I've been waiting so long to post this. So what am I talking about? Today I'm going to be testing out 100% cotton watercolor papers. I have 21 different papers to test out and put side by side to compare, to show you what is out there. I have all the way from inexpensive Amazon, where you can get like 50 sheets, relatively inexpensive, all the way up to the Saunder's Waterford and the Fabriano and Stonehenge and all of that. I am going to talk a little bit about price, but I'm not going to emphasize it too much because I do know that pricing can vary around the world and different things. So I'm going to let you know what the price ranges are for me, but I'm not going to emphasize that as much as I am going to the properties of the paper and how the paper performs. Okay, so each paper has its own unique performance, its own unique strengths and weaknesses and what it is made for and best for. And I'm hoping to share that with you aside from just my personal preference. So everybody's going to have a different preference on what kind of paper they like. The paper I end up saying that I like the most, the ones that I use, may not be the best for you, but I'm hoping in this video it will be able to show you what each paper does well at, and you can see if that matches up with your personal art style. So yeah, I'm going to be telling you what I like, but I do also want you to know these are based on my personal preferences and my personal art style. Okay, so what all are we going to be testing today? Well, first of all, we're going to be talking about watercolor papers sizing. And if you haven't heard about sizing, don't worry, I'm going to explain it to you today. I've done quite a bit of research into it. And when I first heard about sizing, I wasn't really sure. Somebody just said it's glue. But we're going to go into what it actually is and what it does in the paper. Yeah, so that's the first thing we're going to go into. And then we're going to go into testing the papers. We're going to be talking about how well the paper does a flat wash, how well it blends, how well it lifts, how well it scrubs. I did a masking fluid test, wet on wet test, granulating test. So we're going to be going into all of that. And also each paper I painted a sunflower that is just one layer. So we're going to be comparing all of those side by side so you can see how each paper performed in different areas. Short disclaimer here. All of these tests I did to the best of my ability to keep them the same amount of paint and water and everything, but I am human, and watercolor in and of itself has so many variables. Some papers need more water, so many variables that go into this. I tried to keep it as even and the same as possible, but some of the papers have more paint on them than others, and it's not 100%, okay? I just want to put that disclaimer in here. I did my best, but I'm hoping that since I have so many tests, you can at least see how that paper performs and whether it might be for you or not. All right, so let's get into paper sizing. I have a lot of notes on this. I have been looking and researching, and I've sat down several different times and made a bunch of different notes. So I'm going to kind of compile these all together and hopefully make this very simple and understandable as to what paper sizing is, how it is done in the papers, and how it affects your painting. So what is sizing? When I first got into watercolor and I heard people talking about the paper sizing, my first thought is, well, they come in different sizes. But that's not what sizing is. The shallow definition that I heard people say is it's the glue that holds the paper together, but that's not exactly what it is. So I want to explain, first of all, it's not really glue. In most cases, it's a gelatin product. I've heard that some of them are like a starch product, but it's something that is either mixed in or put on top of the paper that affects its absorbency, its strength. So we're going to talk about unsized paper, soft sized paper, and hard sized paper. So unsized paper is something like a paper towel or a tissue paper, something that you put a drop of water on, it's going to absorb all the way into the fibers of that paper. This is not something you can paint on. You could try, but it would not work very well. So I'm going to put like a video of paint on a paper towel or something so you can see how it like just soaks into it right away. Soft size paper is where it has some sizing, but not, but less. So this would be something like a newspaper or something where it will absorb into the paper some, I think, so like printing papers and stuff, those would be soft size papers. Now, hard size papers are more of your art watercolor papers where they have more sizing. And within that range, there's softer sizing and harder sizing. So you can have more absorbent or less absorbent papers. There are two ways that papers are sized. We have internal sizing and external sizing. The internal sizing is basically when they have the, if it's wood pulp, you know, what we're talking about, cotton paper. So they have the cotton fibers, they mix the gelatin in it. In the process of actually making the paper, it's mixed internally with that paper. External sizing is where they either, after the paper's made, they have it sprayed on, or they do a bath, they dunk it in it. So it is sized internally or externally or both. And the amount of sizing greatly affects the way your watercolors apply, how it sinks in, how vibrant the colors are. If there's not enough sizing, the pigments will soak too far into the paper and the paints will appear dull. So there's so much that goes on with the sizing of your paper that greatly affects the paper. Each brand has their own ratios and internal, external. So a lot of the way your papers perform comes down to the sizing of the paper. I hope that made a little bit of sense, just enough where you can kind of comprehend what we're talking about. How do we know what the sizing is on our papers? A lot of manufacturers don't advertise how their papers are sized. So that's a really good question. How do we know? Again, based on the properties of these tests, we can kind of guess or gauge the sizing, if it's softer or harder, if it's internal or external, based on some different tests. So I found this one test online that's called the tape pull test. And the results are actually back here, which we're going to get into. I put a piece of clear tape vertically and horizontally onto the paper. So push it down, and then we lift it off and put it on this black board back here. And since it's a clear piece of tape, we can see the fibers that come off. Some papers, there will be no fibers come off whatsoever. Other papers, the fibers will come like completely covered the tape. There's one in here that's just, it almost wouldn't go on the board because it's covered in fibers. That is one test that you can do to possibly see if it's externally sized. If it's externally sized, then those fibers will be more likely to not come off on the tape. Internally sized might have some paper fibers, cotton fibers come off of it, but also it will tell you how hard or how soft it is sized. If the sizing is hard, meaning there's a lot of sizing in the paper, it's going to come off cleanly and there's going to be no fibers on that tape. If it's a softer sizing, which we will see actually, it's fascinating. There's one paper in here that's super softly sized, and all the tests support that. Yes, let's go ahead and I'm going to show you. Let's just go ahead and look at the board. Okay, so the papers that we have here on this tape pull test, I have some of these are from Amazon, and they're like the brand name is not there. It's just like watercolor pad. So I put like watercolor block navy. I'm going to link them in the description below under these names that I've called them. One of them just says cherries because it has cherries on the front of the watercolor pad. So anyways, here is the board. Actually, I think I'm gonna take a picture and put it here so I can like look and talk. As you can see, we have Meeden first. Not really any fibers on that one. Fabriano cold press, not any fibers. That one came off super clean. That one appears to me to be externally sized, probably internally as well. The watercolor pad, orange and yellow one, came off clean. So most of these are clean. Let's talk about the ones that aren't. First up is B paper. This one had quite a bit of fibers, especially going horizontally. It is a little bit softer sized paper, and so but it was like a good medium. It wasn't quite as bad as some of these others. The Fluid 100 is very fuzzy. This tape came off quite a bit of fibers on that one. Then this paper, you'll see quite a bit of bashing in this video because it's pretty much trash. This paper's not good. But there's two by this brand. One is great and one is awful. So this is Fyess. I'm not sure how you say that, but this is the large size paper that I got. And it had quite a bit of there's some coming off of this tape even. Like there's so much here. And then the Stonehenge. The Stonehenge is the fluffy one. This one is the one that was really difficult to get on the board because it has so much fiber on it. And that one's a really, really soft, delicate paper, which you will see in all of the testing in a moment. All right, Grabie has a little bit. Zen Crafts has a tiny bit right there. And then the Zen Art one has a little bit, but the rest of them came off fairly clean. But yeah, the Baohong, the Fabriano, the Meeden, Fuumuui, and Saunder's Waterford, those all came off pretty much perfectly clean. The other ones have a piece here or there, but there is the sizing test. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of information without overwhelming you, I hope. Okay, so let's go into all of the tests that we did. I've been struggling, honestly, with how I want to structure this video where it is digestible for you. And I think the best way for me to do this is one paper at a time. Instead of talking about the wash on each one and then the fade on each one, I think I'm just going to go one paper at a time. I think that's the best way of doing this. Okay. And again, I'm just, if I did a test a way that you wouldn't have, I'm very sorry. It was actually really, really difficult to get all this done and figure out and compare. But I have lots of notes here and we're going to go into all of these notes. I actually put them in my iPad, so hold on. So the first test I did was the sunflower painting test. And as I was painting the sunflower, Kylie was taking notes for me. So as I'm painting, I'm speaking out loud what things I'm noticing about the paper, and she was writing those notes down for me so that I would have that information each step of the way. Each test I did, I had those notes because they start to run together. There's a lot of papers here, and we're going to see how it did. Okay, so first up is the Fabriano soft press paper. All right, so this one, let's see. Notes that I said while I was painting the sunflower. Pigment sinks in nicely. Soft, I don't know how to explain. Under the brush, it's soft texture, but not like delicate. It's a joy to paint on. Nicely spreading without being uncontrollable. Another thing that I was noting is if they warped it all. So this one had a slight upwards arc when it was wet, but dried mostly flat. So I'm going to be talking about different ways paper warps. When the cotton fibers are wet, they tend to stretch and they will warp in different ways. And as they dry back, they'll either go back flat or they'll go back the other way. This one, it had a slight upwards arc when it was wet, and then it dried pretty flat. So that's pretty good for that one. Then we're going to move on to the tests that I did with this. So again, I did 8 different tests. As I was doing these, this is what I noted. It has nice blends. There was no tape tear. So I did tape in between all of these, and this was just normal, like thin painter's tape. And there was no tape tear on that. Lifts pretty well when wet. It was almost completely when wet. There's a light stain in there. Masking fluid removed very easily. And it lifted moderately after dry, and the colors were nice and vibrant. So if you look, we have our flat wash, we have our fade. This is lifting when wet. This is layering and masking fluid. So the layering on here, you can see very distinct colors. There was no bleeding of that underneath layer. So the sizing is not too hard to where that pigment would just stay on top. This is wet on wet, which the yellow actually ended up bleeding over into it. So the wet on wet bleeds are actually very pretty. And then I did a granulation test on all of these as well. I used, these are all Daniel Smith paints, by the way. I used Lunar Black and Lunar Red Rock to see granulations. So you can see that. This is just a leaf with a detail of my dotting tool. And then this down here is lifting after dry. So this is how much the paper lifted after it was dry. And I try to do the exact same thing on every one. I'm using one brush through all these tests, the exact same colors. And then for the lifting test, I did 3 scrubs. So I get the brush wet, scrub it, wipe it, and I did it 3 times to see how the paper would hold up to scrubbing and how much would come out. Okay, so there's the Fabriano soft pressed. Overall, it performed like I expected. I like this paper. This is my favorite one to paint on. Very, very pleased with this. The texture of the paper itself is, it's not too big. I like softer paper. I don't like it to have too much tooth and grit. So this is personally one of the papers that I like to paint on. Okay, there is paper number 1 down. The rest of these I'm going to try to go a little bit faster so we're not here for 10 days. But next up is Fluid 100. Now if you remember, this is one that did have quite a bit of fibers on its tape pull. I did the tape pulls right here and here on the sunflower page, and I can see where the paper has been ribbed a little bit. Talk about my notes while I was painting the sunflower. Smooth texture. I said smooth texture, but feels scratchy. Interesting. Hard edges and uneven dry. So that I am talking about this section here. If the paper is not drying evenly, you will have hard lines. So if like this section dries faster than this section and not even, there's not horrible hard lines in blooming, but there is a little bit on the brown. I said feels different than most. This is what I'm going to be saying about all the ones, all the papers that are clearly more soft sized, because the ones that felt like this were the ones that did not work well with tape. And when you put the paint to the paper, it does this like pilling looking texture when it's wet. And that goes away when it's dry, but it's kind of like a hot press paper feel. So there's a handful of these papers that feel a little bit more hot pressed and softer and more softly sized. So I'm going to be mentioning that on a few of these. The blends were smooth though. That's something that I found very common with the ones that were softer size. The blends were actually very smooth though. It lifts mostly when wet, so it lifted pretty well. I said very noticeable tear. So this was tearing from just the masking tape here. So a little bit delicate on that. Lifts mostly after dry, but it does not handle the scrubbing very well. There was a little bit of paper damage from the scrubbing process. Overall, it's got fairly good color. And the blends are so smooth, but it's a little bit more of a delicate paper. So you have to be careful if you're using masking fluid and tape and scrubbing. This is a good 1 layer kind of paper. All right, that is Fluid 100. All right, let's move on to Jen Crafts. Jen Crafts is a paper that I had not used before. The first thing I noted is it has a strange uniform texture. Let's see if we can see texture on this paper. I'm trying, I don't know. The paint did not blend into other paints as well on this paper. It dried pretty quickly and it had some hard edging, not too bad, but a little bit. It dried with a slight upward arc, when it was wet, it had a slight upward arc and then it dried inverted. It's fairly flat now. These have been like squished together with things, so they've kind of flattened out a little bit. We move on to this test. I noted that it lifts pretty completely when wet. That means it doesn't soak too far into the paper. It's lifting pretty well. The blends were decent. The vibrancy is quite a bit less on this paper. It's a little bit more dull. This paper did take some damage when scrubbing. I can very clearly see some damage here from the scrubbing, and it did lift fairly well after wet, but it did like start pilling up. So didn't really have any problems with the masking fluid, but there's a little bit of tearing from the tape. With Jen Crafts, that one had a little bit of fibers on the tape pull as well. So this one, the colors overall just look a little bit more dull. in comparison to some of the other tests. I mean, you can even see just those blues right there. So not a huge fan of the Gen Crafts, between the texture, which is just strangely uniform, and the colors not being quite as vibrant, and it being a little bit fragile. So, and there's the granulation test, just for your own personal thoughts. Okay, next up we have watercolor pad in orange and yellow. So this is an inexpensive-ish, I can't remember the price on this one. I'm gonna write the pricing breakdown on the screen at the end, I think, because I don't want to focus too much on it. But this one is from Amazon, and I don't think it costs too much. Let's see, rough texture. So this is a thicker, rougher texture of paper. I hope that you can see paper texture here. The blends were very nice. We had some beautiful blending going on here. As I was painting with it, I said, I don't hate it. So that's good. It had a slight rolling warp. So we have an upward, an inverted, and then a rolling warp is where it's like going this way. Warp while I was painting, so that caused a little bit of paint pooling. Pooling, not pulling, pooling. So something to note, but I overall enjoyed using this paper. Let's look at the test. The colors on this one are actually pretty vibrant. Look at this blue. It lifts mostly when wet, lifted pretty well. There was no tape tear on this one, and it also lifted quite well after it was dry as well. It doesn't sink too far in the page. Those colors stay on top. It's pretty hard size. I would say this is a fairly hard size paper because of the no tape tears and the vibrant colors. It's liftability. So if this is kind of what you're looking for, a hard size paper is gonna be your go-to. But the layering was fine. Masking fluid was fine. So no issues there. This overall is a very good Amazon option. Next one, this is probably one of the most known papers in the watercolor world here. It tested very well, and I'm very pleased with this. This is the Baohong Academy paper. The first thing I said is I like this paper. It works very well. It has pretty blends. It stays wet long enough. There was no warp for this painting. It dry with a slight inverted warp, but it's pretty flat now. It sinks into the page nicely, but still keeps those vibrant colors. Like, it's got a good, nice balance of sizing in this paper. It lifts moderately while wet. There's still a little bit of staining there. Nice vibrancy. I kept noticing the vibrancy of this paper. It didn't lift very well after it was dry. It does handle scrubbing very well, and I've used this a lot. I actually had this in one of my flower everyday videos, and I scrubbed a flower out 3 or 4 times. That was using this paper. There was no tape tear. Overall, I think this is a fantastic paper. Masking fluid was fine. Layering was beautiful. I see no problems with this paper whatsoever. This is a beautiful balance of sizing and paper. The texture is good. It's not too much, not too little. I think this is a fantastic choice of paper. Moving on to New York Central. This is sold at Cherries Artarama. This one has a little bit wider of a texture, so the textures aren't as close together. It's a little bit wider, so it's just a little bit different of a texture. Let's see if I can show you at all. Some texture there. Medium dry time. It was a little bit faster than I would like, but it stayed wet. Whoops, it stayed wet. Okay. There was a slight upward arc when it was wet, but it dried pretty much flat. It's lifts completely when wet. There's a very tiny tint left, but it lifted very well. This one had really good color vibrance as well. The blends on it are decent. They're not the best of all the papers, but the blends are okay. This one doesn't look the greatest, and that could be user error because this one's okay. The granulation on this paper is actually pretty nice. No noticeable tape tear, and it lifts moderately after dry. It took scrubbing just fine, layering and masking fluid just fine as well. Overall, pretty good paper. I think I prefer the Baohong just a little bit more than the New York Central, but again, this is all personal preference. All right, this next one is going to be the biggest downer of the video. This is a paper that was my first professional paper that I liked, but I think it might have just been because it was the first professional paper I used. When you switch over to cotton, it's just a whole different world, and I was like, I love this stuff. But it's a very, very fragile, delicate paper. This is the Stonehenge by Legend. I like painting on this. I still like this paper, but it has big downfalls. So things I noted, paint sinks in nicely. It does sink in pretty well. There's quite a bit of blooming actually on this specific painting, but I said the blends were soft. It had a very tiny upward arc when it was wet. I like painting on this one. I enjoy it. I dried pretty flat. But let's go into this test. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. It lifts moderately when wet. There's still quite a bit of staining left in there, and that is a good indicator of a softer sized paper. Another thing that's a good indicator of it is it tears a lot. So not only the tape pull test, but the tape test on here, it tore pretty much everywhere and pulled pieces off. Like, this does not handle tape at all. Even the masking fluid rips some of that paper off. Scrubbing rips some of that paper off. So it's a very, very delicate paper. It's great if you don't make mistakes. It's great if you want really nice blends, softer size, have some beautiful blends in them. The layering was actually fine on this. Again, it's just one test and one layer, but it's a beautiful paper for specific things. It's not going to work for everybody. If you tape your papers down, this is a no-go. Even using their blocks, taking them off of the block, you have to be very, very careful because you will tear that paper getting it off the block. I like this paper, but you have to baby it, and it's for specific things. So pretty, but fragile. This one surprised me a lot. I haven't used this one a ton. I've used it a few times, and I didn't have like strong feelings about it, but now I do. This is the Saunder Waterford. It has a nice medium texture, not too much. It's a little bit wider of a texture than some, but it's not too deep. It's just a nice medium. It has soft blends, beautiful, beautiful blends. It stays wet long enough. You've got enough play time. It doesn't dry too fast. I said this is a beautiful paper. It had a tiny, tiny upward arc when it was wet, but then it dried flat. It lifts almost completely. Oh, let's pull this one out. It lifts almost completely when wet. The blends are nice and beautiful and soft. The colors are pretty vibrant on here. They're a little bit more dulled than some of the other ones that we've seen, but they are fairly vibrant. No tape tear, and it lifts fairly well when dry. Not completely, but fairly well. It looks like the layering may have blended together a little bit. So layering may have to be delicate with. I'm not sure. It looks like it blended away just a tiny bit on that layering. Sturdy paper. This is a really good option. This is an expensive option. This is an expensive option for me from where I am. This one costs quite a bit. Not my number one choice, but it is very, very good paper. All right, we're getting through these. I know there's a lot. There is a lot of information here. If you are still sticking around, thank you so much for watching. Oh my goodness. This took me a lot. This took a lot. Okay, the next one is Watercolor Block Navy from Amazon. This one surprised me a lot. Some of the Amazon ones shocked me. Surprisingly bad and surprisingly good. This is a good one. This one feels nice and thick. The pigment stays put. It doesn't move too much. If you look where I touched wet on wet here, the yellow doesn't blend into the brown that much. I initially had mixed feelings on this. It dried with a slight inverted arc, so this way. It lifts when wet moderately well. The colors on this, though, are the most vibrant of all of them. This is probably one of the more vibrant colored papers. So that means this is not soaking too far into the paper. Those pigments are staying on top. There was no tape tear. I overall really, really like this. This layered well, no blending of those layers. The masking fluid lifted well. Overall, this is a really solid option from Amazon. I really, really enjoyed this paper. All right, so moving on to another Fabriano. This is the cold press this time. This one's a little bit more readily available and in different sizes. I didn't say this at the beginning, but I cut them all down to 5x7s. I might have to add that in there. Fabriano cold press. This is beautiful blends. It had an upward arc when wet, a little bit more than the soft press did, and then it dried with like a rolling warp. I think that this one is a beautiful, beautiful paper. Doesn't lift the greatest. So this is the lift when wet, not the best at lifting. The blends are very, very beautifully smooth. Nice vibrancy. This one has pretty good vibrancy, but again, compared to that last one that I told you has like insane vibrancy, you can see this is the last one. This is the Fabriano. This one just has such intense vibrancy, but this one's still very, very good. It really kind of depends on what you're looking for in your paper. The layering did great. No blending or moving of that. Granulation is okay and nice and soft. Overall, I like this one. I do prefer the soft press just a little bit. The texture is a little different, but the texture of this one is also good as well. It's not too toothy and gritty. I'm not like an Arches fan with like the really gritty texture. I like it to be a little bit smoother, and that's kind of what this cold press is. Moving on to an Amazon option that I'm not a huge fan of, but I could see people using it. Slight texture, nicely random. So the texture is nice. It's not too weird and uniform. When I was painting with it, my first initial was like, I'm unsure of this paper. It was okay. There was nothing great. There was nothing bad. It's just kind of forgettable. It also dried with a slight inverted warp, but the downfall of this paper is the tape tear. So it did tear quite a bit. And even with like the masking fluid, I couldn't get all the masking fluid off. There's still a little bit there. Tore the paper. It lifted fairly well when wet. It lifted moderately when dry. Layering appears to be fine. The blends were not the smoothest, but not bad. The color vibrancy is there though. This has some pretty vibrant color to it and soft granulation. So it's not the worst paper out there, but it's not one that I'm going to personally repurchase and use again. Okay, moving on. This one is DHAIQC. I do not know how to say that brand, but that's what this is. I said this one feels nice under the brush. It has soft blends. It had a really big upward arc when it was wet, and then it dried with a rolling warp. Overall, I really enjoy the sunflower painting on this one. Here is the other testing. It's lifted pretty well when it was wet. There was no tape tear on this one. This one is a little bit more dull than the rest though. This definitely colors are a little bit more muted. This one warped quite a bit. You can even see on this side here how it was warping and all that water pulled to this side and then caused this blooming and backwash here. And even the layering is just okay on it. This one is not the greatest of the inexpensive options. It's not a bad paper, but I think that there are better ones. All right, next up is Cherries. This one has cherries on the front of the cover. So this one is quite textured. If you like a deep textured paper, this one might be for you. It had a slight rolling warp when it was wet. It dried with a little bit of an inverted warp. The warping did cause a little bit of problems in the testing, kind of like the last one. It caused some paint pulling. But yeah, the texture is very, very noticeable in this paper. So if you're wanting a textured paper, this might be your option. Where it had some downfalls, you can see here. Tape tear. The tape tore on it. The tape tore the paper a little bit on this one. The masking fluid, I did note, removed very easily from this one. And then it lifts pretty well when dry. Colors on this one are pretty vibrant. I would say it's really good in the vibrancy area. The layering did okay, not the greatest of layering. I feel like this one's fairly hardly sized aside from that tape tear. How did this one do on here? Yeah, there was no fibers on the tape pull test, just for some reason right there at the beginning of that one, but this one's decent. If you like a more textured paper and you want a cheaper option, then this one might be your choice. All right, let's talk about bee paper. This is another one that's pretty well known in the YouTube space. for being an inexpensive option of cotton paper. So of course I had to test this one out. This one has a smoother texture. Now when I was talking before about, I think it was the Fluid 100, it has that more hot press feel, and when the paint is wet it looks like it's pilling a little bit. That's what this one is as well. But it's a smoother texture. It has beautiful blends though. I wrote different but good. It's just a different feel. It had a tiny upward arc when it was wet and then slight inverted when it was dry. The color vibrancy is pretty good on this. It lifted somewhat mostly when wet. There's still some spots that were like sticking. So if it lifts inconsistently across the paper, that means that the sizing is not super even on the paper. So it might have slight sizing issues and consistency. It did have a little bit of tape tear. This is a softer paper. And it did take some damage while scrubbing. So this is another one that's a little bit more delicate, but not quite as delicate as the Stonehenge. But this one is a little bit more delicate of a paper. So again, I think it's more of a softer sized paper. The colors are slightly dulled, but still vibrant enough. That is the B paper. I think this is a good option if you don't mind having a slightly delicate paper. The granulation was just okay in it. Layering did perfectly fine. So there is the B paper. And again, that's the 100% cotton B paper. All right, next up is Zen Art. I had never used this paper. This one has a soft texture. I said it reminds me of the B paper. It is very similar in the texture of it. It had a rolling warp when it was wet, and then it dried with that rolling warp. Water is sinking into the paper, so therefore that's telling me it's a little bit more soft sized. So the softer papers, the soft size, it's going to sink in a little bit more, which we'll see in the vibrancy actually over here. Actually lifted pretty well when it was wet. It did take some damage while scrubbing. I don't think it had any tape tear though, so that's good. And it didn't lift too great after dry. Layering looks like it was fine. Masking fluid came off fine. Not a ton of granulation happening. This has actually quite a bit of, I guess I had too much water here in the middle and there's like blooming on either sides of that. It's not the most vibrant, and I mean, in general, the blends don't look the smoothest on this paper. So this is probably one that I would pass if you were looking at B paper versus this. I would probably go with B paper. But again, I need to play with this one some more. But at the moment, this one's not like a favorite for me. Next one, I think the brand is Wishlist or I don't know. Again, I'm going to be putting these on the screen. So, all right, this one has a nice medium texture. When I was painting, I said it's working. It has some slight blends, doesn't like explode into colors very much. It had a upward arc when it was wet and it dried pretty flat. I didn't have much to say about this test. The blends aren't my favorite. It looks like it lifted pretty well when it was wet, lifted okay after dry. It looks like the masking fluid had a really hard time coming off. There's still a little bit of masking fluid on there. I don't see any, yeah, there is some tape tear as well on this paper. So this one is a little bit softer and it's not quite as vibrant as some of the others, but that's pretty blend. Tiny bit of granulation. I don't know. This one's just okay. It's not great. It's not bad. It's just, it's an okay paper. Okay, now we're getting into the worst paper. This one is a 100% do not buy. I'm going to check the listing again because I don't see how this can be cotton paper, and it's definitely not 140 pound, but I got this in the small size and the big size, and the big size is the large is the one that is not good. First of all, the color of it is kind of a grayish blue. It does not look like the rest of the papers. Let me show you the color difference. It's got a very gray cast to it, and it's very, very flimsy. So I said gray light color, thin paper, very strange uniform texture. It had some hard edging, not too bad. It looks very dull. It dried kind of like wobbly. It's since flattened out a little bit. It's just so fluffy. It lifted pretty well when wet. It did have quite a bit of tape tear on this one. Layering was fine, lifted mostly when dry. There's a little bit of granulation, and the colors overall are just okay on it. In general, I would caution you to skip this one because it's not on the same level as any of these other ones. It's just not. I mean, it ripped. This is the one that ripped into the paper when I was pulling that, like it took some of my flower off. So I would stay away from this one, and I'm going to make sure to note in where I'm linking all of these that this is the one that's really, really flimsy. Okay. Next up is the Fuumuui paper. This one has a medium texture, slightly uneven when drying, but just ever so slightly uneven drying. It wasn't awful. It dried with a small rolling warp. Some of the warping did cause a little bit of paint pulling. It had good blends though. This one, like the yellow blended out into here. Ignore this right here. I accidentally got a dot of blue after everything was dry. But the blends are pretty good. The vibrancy is actually not bad on this one. There was a very, very little bit of tape tear. Lifted pretty well when wet. And actually it feels like it lifted even better after dry. Quite a bit of good granulation going on. Layering looks fine. Masking fluid lifted just fine. So overall, this is a pretty good option. And I have actually used this one quite a bit in the past. And I really enjoy painting on this paper. So I feel like this is a really good, more inexpensive option. Yeah, so there's the Fuumuui. Okay, here's the Fyess small. So the other one was the large. That was flimsy. This is supposed to be the same paper. This is not. This is so much better. This has beautiful soft blends in it. It had a slight rolling warp when it was wet and small rolling warp when dry. The paint sits on top of the paper just a little bit. It lifts mostly when wet. Has very nice vibrancy. These are pretty nice vibrant colors. I actually enjoy the granulation on this one as well. Scrubbing took it totally fine. No damage there. No tape tear. And it lifts pretty well when wet. The layering looks good. Overall, I really enjoy this paper. I think this is one of the more inexpensive ones, and it comes with a bunch of papers. So this is one I highly, highly recommend, especially if you are newer and just don't want to spend a ton on paper. I actually really, really enjoy this specific paper. So, all right, next one is Tumuarta. We are almost done. We got a couple more, guys. This one had a rolling warp when it was wet. This one is interesting. It's got a fairly big texture, but not deep, like it's looser texture. It dried nice and flat. It lifts cleanly. When wet, has a really good lift. It didn't really move much. Like the colors did not bleed out too much. So if you want some more movement in your paper, this one's probably not gonna be the one you reach for. It also did pretty good job lifting after it was dry. No tape tear on this one, and it took scrubbing just fine. Layering looks pretty good as well. The colors are a little bit muted on this one, not quite as vibrant as some of the other ones. There is the Tumuarta. I think I like the Fuumuui over this one. Again, it's all my personal preference. All right, the last one. We're at the last paper. Whew! I don't know how I'm gonna edit all this. This is Meeden. Now I do wanna note, Baohong and Meeden seem to be connected somehow. I ordered Meeden and got more Baohong. And so I was getting ready for the video and I was like, where did my Meeden go? And I went to my orders and it sent me Baohong. So I don't know if Baohong is now being sold by Meeden or if they've merged, or I don't know. But I ordered Meeden again and got the Meeden paper, like the actual, it says Meeden on it. So I'm not sure if they're different papers or not. I'm gonna hold them side by side in just a second. I haven't done that yet. But let's talk about this one. This one had a very small warp. It has nice blends, very even dry, good color vibrancy. I enjoyed the vibrancy on this paper. It stays wet, but it does soak in nicely. It lifts pretty well when wet, lifts okay when dry. It was fine with the scrubbing though, no tape tear at all. I like the vibrancy and the blends on this one. This one looks like I did have a little bit too much water in here, so it kind of pushed that color down, but they blend into each other nicely. Layering is beautiful, no problem with the masking fluid. I actually really enjoy the Meeden paper. That is all the papers. Let's look at the Baohong next to the Meeden though. So I'm looking at the back first to look at the textures. They look very, very similar. But let's see how they performed. side by side. Oh, wow. Yeah, these are pretty identical. Even down to the two color fade, they both have like backwash on them. So maybe that's not a me thing. Maybe that's the paper thing. These look very, very similar in, I obviously put more blue on this one than this one. But they're very, very similar in performance. So they may be the exact same paper. I don't know that. I can't say that. But I do know that they seem to be connected in some way, shape, or form. So let's talk about my top and my bottom, okay? Let's look at this. So obviously, you know I like the Fabriano. That's what I use. Fabriano soft press is my #1 choice. You can only get it in the giant sheets. So it's not accessible to everyone because you have to put a chunk sum down to get, you know, the paper. It does last me quite a while, but you've got to pay more up front. The Fabriano cold press is another good option. That one comes in different sizes. It is a little bit easier to get your hands on. I actually really, once it surprised me that I enjoyed. Let's talk about that. Obviously the Baohong Academy performed very well. So that one and the Meeden, I actually really, really recommend. I love those. Was not a fan of the Grabie or the Gin Crafts, not a huge fan of those. I actually thought I was gonna like Fluid 100 more because I've used that quite a bit and I do like painting on it. The Fuumuui was good. Where was there was another cheap one that I liked a lot. Was it the Cherries? I think it was Cherries. I think I told you earlier, the Cherries. Bee paper is not gonna be my go-to. I might need to look at the pricing breakdowns. I'm gonna put that on the screen now of how much per sheet they are. I was gonna do per square inch, but it just didn't make sense to do it that way. So I'm gonna put per sheet. These are all different sizes. I cut them all to 5x7 for testing purposes, but do know that that sheet could be a 5x7 or it could be 11x14 or whatever. So it's not perfect comparison there, but it's just a general, these are cheaper, these are more expensive. I may put it on there, cheap to expensive actually, but yeah. And the Saunder Waterford I actually enjoyed a lot more than I thought I was going to. Oh, the Fyess, that's the other cheap one that really surprised me and I really, really enjoy. Let me see if there's any other notes. So I had so much information to spit at you. I'm so sorry if it was just like overload, and there's probably some things that I forgot to mention. It's just been like so much trying to organize all of my thoughts, but I hope this video was a little bit helpful. If you have any questions about any of these papers, please let me know in the comments below. And if I said anything incorrectly, please let people know in the comments below. I don't mind being corrected. This is just information that I've gathered. I'm actually going to link an article on paper sizing and watercolor paper in the description because it's where I got a lot of good information from. So if you want to see more of the science of sizing, it's a really good, easy to understand article. So I'm going to link that in the description below so you can read that if you want to. But yeah, let me know what your favorite paper is. If you want me to test out non-cotton papers, I can, but I highly recommend if you are newer and you're not getting the results you want, try out some cotton watercolor paper. It does make such a big difference. And there are some more affordable options out there now. And so that's why I'm hoping this information will help you in your watercolor journey. And I think that's all. I think I'm gonna go take a breath now. I feel like I've been holding my breath this entire video. I'm trying to say everything correctly and give you the most accurate information possible. So if you did enjoy this video though, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps our channel out. And if you haven't already and you want to see future videos, hit that subscribe button down below and I will see you guys next time. Bye. But basically I feel like a setting is off on my camera. Why is it not focusing? Where's the DA blah, blah, blah? Where is it? Where is it?